the first thought is always environmental, right? So we always think of sustainability to do with looking after the planet. But actually, of course, there are other aspects of sustainability as well that we don't forget, but it's easy to focus just on the environmental. And I
Yep.
think that's where the evolution of sustainability is coming into play more so now. So the social part of sustainability is also really important. And we're beginning to see that come through in a lot of what companies and organizations are trying to do. One market that I'm fascinated by is the clean market. For consumers, it has really taken off. So for them, it's kind of like anti-aging. As soon as you say the term, you kind of know roughly what you're talking about.
Yep.
Problem with clean is you can't define it. I've sat in a room full of formulators before and asked them to define it. No one can define it. If I'm looking for a clean product on our GMPD, for example, there isn't a clean tab I can press. I'm looking for, am I looking for natural? Am I looking for organic? Am I looking for vegan? There's so many different markers of it. So it's a difficult one to understand.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to What's Your Purpose by Croda. That clip was from our guest on the podcast this month, Andrew McDougall, the Director of Beauty and Personal Care for Mintel. Andrew was really the perfect person for our first episode. We covered the sustainability needs of the personal care market, and Andrew has over a decade of experience in the industry. Since joining Mintel in 2016, he's led the teams on trends, delivered projects to clients all around the world, and has been featured at some of the biggest and best beauty industry events. Andrew also has the perfect podcasting background, funny enough, honing his analytics and broadcast skills as a journalist for 10 years prior to joining Mintel. He spent 7 years reporting on the cosmetics industry, interviewing top industry figures, and reporting on all aspects from formulation and packaging to finance and market trends. On this episode, we're talking about how sustainability continues to evolve the personal care industry and how brands and suppliers can adapt to the changes we're seeing. So we're covering topics like circular economy, packaging trends, the importance of transparency and sharing data, also some fun topics like sustainable formats and incorporating joy-based selling strategies. And we even ask Andrew to define what sustainability means to him. We find out our favorite question, what's your purpose? So you'll be able to hear him answer how he thinks Mintel is accelerating the shift to a more sustainable personal care industry. So it was really just a great and a fun episode all around. If you're looking for sustainability trends, or if you want to learn more about how conscious consumers are driving change in personal care, this episode is definitely for you. We can't wait to hear what you think about it, so remember to subscribe and send us topics that you want to hear about in the future. Now let's take it away with our first and latest episode of What's Your Purpose? So, hi everyone. Welcome to Purposeful Beauty, What's Your Purpose, hosted by Croda. Our podcast aims to discuss the role sustainability is playing towards shaping the future of beauty. And today we're really excited to bring you our very first episode of this podcast. So my name is Christina Richardson. I'm marketing coordinator for the beauty care sustainability team at Croda, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Jolene Maloney. Jolene, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Christina. So my name's Jolene Maloney. I'm marketing manager for beauty care sustainability here at Croda, and I'm super happy as well to be part of our very first episode of What's Your Purpose? So today we'll be discussing the future of beauty and personal care, looking at 2022 and beyond, with of course a focus on sustainability. And we're delighted to be joined by one of Mintel's experts today, Director of Beauty and Personal Care, Andrew McDougall. He'll be speaking with us about some of the trends that he's seeing in the market. So hello, Andrew.
Hi there, hi both. Thank you very much for having me on. I'm honoured to be on the first one for you. So I'm really looking forward to this.
I guess we can just jump right in and ask you our lead question for this podcast, which is, what's your purpose? So by this, we mean, how does Mintel support and accelerate the move to a more sustainable beauty industry? What is Mintel doing to really facilitate this?
Well, from a sort of a working point of view, working with clients, I guess, and I guess with all the data that we find, is we want to kind of understand what the consumer wants and why, and where they are in sort of their sustainability journey. So we can find out that information, that data, and then by having these conversations with clients or having presentations, and sort of looking into the research a bit more, we can then sort of sculpt sort of how the consumer's feeling and what their sentiments are for certain things. So is the consumer looking to sort of monitor their own environmental impact, for example, things like that? But it goes obviously much further to then think, okay, am I going to pay more for something that is sustainable or not? And then with that, we're also able to track that over time. So we run research surveys throughout the year, every year. And some of these surveys, particularly on topics like sustainability, we will trend those questions. So every year we'll ask the same question to see whether that's sort of going up or down in the consumer
Mhm.
mind. And then from there, we can then sort of understand if consumers are thinking more about certain things or less about certain things. It's been fascinating over the last couple of years because I think the sustainability conversation has evolved. It's accelerated. We what we always see around the time, when we have the climate change summits, there's always a big sort of boost then in sort of the conversations that are happening.
It's
So it's
true.
really interesting to sort of see consumer sentiment around that. Um, and then just about the terms used as well. I mean, I find one of the most fascinating ones I find is around sort of carbon claims. So like carbon neutral, carbon positive, carbon negative. It's very interesting when we ask consumers about that because we can then sort of say to brands, well, actually, there's a lot of confusion here. And we can say that's obviously not just brands, but suppliers as well. There's confusion over what these claims mean. So therefore, we maybe need to do a bit more to educate, or are there things we can do to make things a little bit clearer? So I guess our purpose from a business point of view will be to sort of help our clients basically try and navigate this world of sustainability because it's a tricky one. We don't have the answer because otherwise we'd have done it already, right? We'd already be
Yeah,
circular, so we'd be fine. So it's really
exactly.
interesting as well to sort of work with the data, work with our clients, work on sort of the trends going forward. We can see where we can help companies navigate what they need to do to or communicate to consumers, how we can educate going forward. So I think our purpose is definitely bringing you the consumer sentiment so we can work on strategies to sort of deliver sustainable practices to them.
And then hopefully, I guess that really helps speed up the take up on, when it comes to sustainability. If brands are able to work with the data you've supplied, that hopefully they can react more quickly and yeah, move towards a more sustainable future more quickly, I guess.
Yeah, it's always a really fascinating thing to see what questions are asked of us. If you go back 5 years, the big questions are always, is it gonna is it- do are people willing to pay more, for example? And
Yeah.
we found that people were saying they were willing to pay more because obviously suppliers and manufacturers need to know that because obviously sometimes the alternatives can be more expensive,
Yeah.
which again may evolve and change over time. And as I say, you fast forward 5 years to now, and actually alternatives are becoming more possible. We are seeing the option for more sustainable solutions becoming much more viable and appealing as well. So it's really interesting to see that evolution. It's also really interesting as well because in market research, and I think with sustainability, there's this say do gap. There's this idea that we'll always say something. Like if I ask you the question
Mhm.
on a survey now, do you want to be sustainable? You're probably going to say yes. However, actually doing it is something completely different. And I know companies have always struggled with that and
Yeah.
consumers struggle with that as well. So again, I think if we're going to move towards circular economies, which seem to be the best solutions going forward, then we need to work all together, don't we? Really, because everyone's going to be involved in that. So I think that's always a really
100%.
interesting sort of angle to look at it as well.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. I think brands need to, I mean, looking at Mintel and seeing all the latest launches in certain markets and with certain claims, brands are putting out products that have some of the sustainability claims that consumers want because of the information that Mintel gives to their clients, to the brands and suppliers. So it's really good to see that this is happening. I think also a big part of it is defining what the consumers want. Like you said, there's a lot of confusion with sustainability and what exactly is it and what claims should we want to take on and what is not maybe the consumer's priority at this time right now. So Mintel does a really good job at looking at the insights for consumers and defining what they want. I guess in terms of what sustainability is, what to yourself, what is sustainability to you? How do you define sustainability?
Sustainability is always a really, because the first thought is always environmental, right? So we always think of sustainability to do with looking after the planet. But actually, of course, there are other aspects of sustainability as well that we don't forget, but it's easy to focus just on the environmental. And
Yep.
I think that's where the evolution of sustainability is coming into play more so now. So the social part of sustainability is also really important. And we're
Mhm.
beginning to see that come through in a lot of what companies and organizations are trying to do. Um, Obviously, and the other aspect as well is the financial side, so the economy side of things. We have to be financially sustainable, obviously, to exist. So
Mhm.
that's a part that I think maybe we think about less. It's definitely a part that we don't sort of tend to focus on with consumers as much. We'll ask consumers about their own finances and things like that. But when it comes to sustainability, it's very much the focus is on the environmental impact. And I actually think that's where the evolution is interesting to watch now, because one market that I'm fascinated by is the clean market. I say
Yeah.
clean with you can't on a podcast you can't see me doing the quote marks, but exactly. But the clean market is fascinating because for consumers it has really taken off. So for them it's kind of like anti-aging. As soon as you say the term, you kind of know roughly what you're talking about.
Yep.
Problem with clean is you can't define it. I've sat in a room full of formulators before and asked them to define it. No one can define it. If I'm looking for a clean product on our GMPD, for example, there isn't a clean tab I can press. I'm looking for, am
It's
I looking for
true.
natural? Am I looking for organic? Am I looking for vegan? There's so many different markers of it. So it's a difficult one to understand. And from a formulation side of things, I really don't like the term clean. Because obviously the sort of connotations, sort of the connections to other ingredients being dirty or unworthy to be in
Right.
cosmetics products. So I don't
Right.
particularly like that side of the industry, but it's really fascinating to see how clean is really important for consumers. And I think going forward, sustainability will play a big role in that. So rather than just being, because particularly if you're on the market in most Western markets and most markets globally, regulation puts things into play that most products on the shelves are going to be safe.
Yep.
So by that regard, everything is going to be safe for you in cosmetics. Um, so then I think that's where sustainability, ethics, and social matters sort of propel clean a little bit forward. So hopefully that can be much more positive going forward. I personally would
Sure.
love to see a step away from clean. However, we do, as I say, we do know from our consumer data, particularly in the US, in North American markets,
Yeah.
the term clean is really just, it's a great way to sort of know exactly what you're talking about for a lot of consumers.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
that's
true.
it's interesting as well, actually, because it's making me think. You mentioned the US, then I'm guessing that claim clean probably varies region by region what that means, and is that what you're finding then?
Yeah, we get so many people, so many clients, sorry, asking about what is clean. And as I say, we can't define it. I would ask formulators to define it. They're much smarter than I, and they can't define it. So it's very difficult because
Yeah.
it doesn't have a definition. I think it's been a marketing thing that a lot of companies have, or a lot of brands have maybe taken and just thought, right, we'll run with clean because that resonates with consumers. So there's a lot of sort of misinformation around. There's no clarity. I think that's the problem.
Yeah.
As I say, Western markets definitely seems to take over more. I think Europe has caught up, sort of, especially Western Europe. I think maybe understand clean. The fascinating thing is we get asked a lot, oh, what is the clean beauty trend? And it's fascinating when we then talk to them, because again it's something that means something completely different to them, but they're very interested in knowing what it means because they know it's important to consumers. And so that's when you find there are really regional differences to look at all aspects of sustainability and all aspects of social and everything else that makes up clean. So it's fascinating to see how we do have to have these different approaches, and I think that's where going forward there needs to be this next step of clarification on what this means globally, because as I say, if you go to Asia, clean means something completely different. So it's a very different conversation to have depending where you are.
Yeah, definitely. So we're finding that lots of our customers, they seem to be prioritizing transparency more than ever. Um, so looking at the sourcing and the supply chain and the information surrounding that, Is that something as well that you're seeing an increase in demand for, that kind of information?
Yeah, so consumers are demanding more transparent, which is always, I always find the word transparency is interesting when we in cosmetics, because it's very difficult to be transparent with everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
you again, both of you will probably know better than I with regards to what your business is doing. It can be very difficult to be transparent, and also be effective in your communication, because you might be transparent, but you might be saying something that the layman maybe is difficult for them to understand. So
It's true.
it's such a fascinating concept. Consumers want transparency, is what I would say we've seen. It's about how we find that. So simple messaging, and I guess that's maybe where clean cuts through a lot of it for consumers, because it's just that thought of, okay, clean must be safe and sustainable and ethical. Um, so I think that's really interesting to look at. What we have seen is consumers are looking into brands, looking into products, looking into companies more,
Mm-hmm.
and that affects obviously your customer, but it affects you as well, because again, what you can then communicate becomes really important as well. I think when we look at, that's always been the problem with transparency around ingredient lists, is many cosmetics will have long ingredient lists, and
Mm-hmm.
brands themselves don't have full transparency on everything within that ingredient list themselves, or the supply chain themselves. So there is this real knock-on effect that we then all have to sort of play our role in. And so I think I always it brings a smile to my face when we talk about transparency, because we do want it and we do need to work towards it. It's very difficult to do, and it's about much more again than just sourcing.
Yeah.
It's about, again, all these different ethical markers and morality markers and things that people are looking at. I think the pandemic that we've had over the last couple of years has made people sort of stop and think about what companies are doing. So when there were so many fantastic initiatives from companies making hand sanitizer, dropping their normal day to day, and actually pitching in making PPE or making
Mm-hmm.
hand sanitizer and masks and things, all these wonderful initiatives people put in place, it was really great, because it was this kind of humanity sort of trend, if you like, of actually, you know what, the world is a great place. But people start paying attention now more to, okay, what are brands and companies doing? So that becomes really important. Um,
Yeah.
and then for consumers as well, social media then impacts that as well, because you can try being transparent as possible, you can try say the right things, but we live in a world where unfortunately polarization is the aim of the game, isn't it, on social? So you may say something, but someone's always looking to knock you down. So transparency is a fascinating area, I think, to look at. Um, and I'd be very interested to know what your sort of thoughts on that as well are, because as I say, it's such an easy concept to agree with, and then a difficult one to actually put into play.
It's totally true, isn't it, Christina? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like you're saying, Andrew, with complex supply chains, it's easier said than done. It's something that we're trying our hardest with at Croda, and it's something that we're pursuing and pushing forward more and more to be as transparent as possible with our customers. And it's a journey. We're getting there. It's a lot of, I think a lot of it is around data collation as well, and the way that that can be effectively shared, because there are so many different data points. Yeah, it's complex.
Yeah, I also think it's about, in terms of sharing data in a transparent way, it's about being authentic and not just being performative with, like you say, social media, with the way that you're sharing your information on social media. You're not just checking the boxes in terms of our ingredients are clean or we're being transparent about this. It has to be authentic. And like you said, consumers are looking into brands and products more and more, so they'll be able to sniff out if it's not authentic. They'll be able to understand if you're truly an ethical and a sustainable company, better than you probably realize. So I guess, is there any way that you think brands can be as authentic as possible in terms of sharing this data and being transparent? Do you think that there's definitely ways to do it or ways not to?
I think the ways to do it is it's actually realizing what not to do. I think is really important sometimes. I think it's taking that moment to be like, you know what, this is a really important sort of moment. This is a really important cultural signifier that's happening right now. But
Mhm.
actually, you know what, I'm not right to play in that space. I don't have to play in every single game, if you get what I mean. It's kind of,
Exactly.
we see that sort of year on year when there's with those. sort of around International Women's Day, you'll have a lot of posts around sort of females within industry, females within organizations. And again, that's fantastic. And
Yep.
I'm not saying that that shouldn't be promoted. However, if you don't have, if you're not currently working on your gender pay gap, for example, people can easily find that out now. And if you're posting all the day, all the day long about these wonderful women in business that you have, but your gender pay gap is horrific, then consumers are going to tap into that. So it's about just understanding what you should be playing in and what you shouldn't be playing in. There's a famous example, I think, from Pepsi a few years ago when the sort of the Black Lives Matter was happening, and there was all these
Mm-hmm.
Sort of marches that were taking place. And I think they ran a Kendall Jenner advert. If you've seen it, then you'll know immediately what I'm talking about. But she basically looks to sort of
Yes.
solve this rift between the protesters and the police that were meeting with these barrier shields. But it was all broken down over a can of Pepsi. So it's kind of
Right.
like that wasn't the place to play in that. I kind of, again, the sentiment was probably good. It probably was a good idea. We'd
Mm-hmm.
like to do something in this space, but it's just knowing how you can play in that space. If you don't belong in that space in the first place, why would you? Why would you try and shoehorn yourself in? We see it with Pride as well every year. Again, every sort of when Pride Month comes around, you'll see a lot of companies sort of with the rainbow logos and all these other things. And again, it's just like, okay, why is that just for 1 month of the year? So it has to be. I think it has to be within the DNA of your company. I'm not saying it has to be the strongest thing that your company goes for, but it just has to be that authentic part of your company day to day
Mm-hmm.
that you're doing. I mean, Croda would be a great example of I mean, obviously not a brand, but from a supply point of view, if you just randomly started talking about energy and sort of clean energy or renewable energy and things like that, just because you were jumping on a bandwagon, people were like, well, you've never cared about it before. But I know, for
Totally.
example, I know that a lot of your facilities are sort of run by solar panels, and you have so many
Mm-hmm.
energy initiatives that you have going on that it kind of makes sense for you to just continue those kind of conversations. So it's about knowing, it's about picking your battles, I think. And it's not necessarily battles, that's probably the wrong term, but it's about knowing, I think, which instances you can play in and which
Yep.
instances you should just leave alone. It's fine. Someone else is probably better placed to play in that particular field.
Yeah,
Definitely. I also think for sustainability, in terms of being authentic and verifying the claims that you're putting forth, there's a lot of new online tools or apps or like that can verify these claims or accreditation schemes that us as Croda have, spoken to and applied to some of them. Brands can do this too. Consumers are likely looking for this because they know it's verified. This is Sephora Clean or this is XYZ approved. So, do you see a growth in these types of accreditation schemes or online tools that
Yeah,
assist consumers with vetting out the
I think
authentic brands?
I think metrics are kind of the way to get the information across quite simply and quickly to consumers, which is ultimately, I mean, convenience is still a big driver for a lot of
Yeah.
consumers. So, yeah, I think these are great tools to sort of just have these markers. We see a lot of these rating tools in place now through supply
Mhm.
chains, and then obviously to the consumer as well. These sort of tick boxes. So I think this is really important because it does give you a bit more transparency. It kind of shows the journey a bit as well, rather than just hearing that company X has made a 2025 or 2030 sustainability goal, and then you see if it gets ticked off. The
Right.
progress report, I think, becomes really important. And I think understanding what companies are doing, not just from environmental impact, from, okay, how are you reducing waste, looking at energy consumption,
Mhm.
looking at, as I say, social factors as well, your workers' rights, how are your workers treated. All these things I think are really important now. And we're beginning to see these metrics highlighting that a little bit more. Um, so I do think it's really important and really interesting to see. I do also think there's a little bit of caution to be sort of brought to this area though, because sometimes if you have like some of these apps on your phone that you were mentioning there, Christina,
Yep.
that where you can maybe you can go into a shop and scan a barcode,
Yep.
and maybe you'll come out and find, oh, there's a product or a brand that's sustainable or it's not. My question around that, or my caution around that, would be, where is that information from? So is it collated by a third party, and what
It's
are
true.
the vested interests of that third party? So that can be the. I think these are great, but I think there's still, obviously, this still needs to be refined as well, because, as I say, some apps may have biases or they may not be collating all of the data. So it can be very difficult to sort of have a well-rounded view. So before we start sort of boycotting brands because of what an app says, I think obviously a little bit more care needs to be taken. But I do think these kind of tools and ratings
Yeah.
and metrics are really important. Um, I know that in the beauty industry that have you heard of the Eco Beauty Consortium, which was announced a few weeks ago, which is like 36 different associations and companies in the beauty space that have all decided to group together on sustainable practices. So there's this idea that they're going to be sharing their best practices
Mm.
um, moving forward, and there's going to be, I think there's markers in place there as well. So it's maybe not for the consumer side of things, but from
Yeah.
the actual industry, it's nice to see that we'll actually be able to grade each other and help each other out a bit more. So I think these are the right steps that we should be taking forward. They just
Yeah.
need to continue evolving.
Yeah, brilliant. Sustainability is such a big topic, isn't it? I think it's great to see consortiums like this coming together because it's not something that can be tackled individually, right? People need to work together to move all of this forward and all these different aspects as well. So, like you say, from the transparency of ingredients, but also through to ethics and
Yeah.
all these different areas like that. So.
I think that's going to be the future for sustainability in terms of we don't know exactly what the future is going to look like, but I think going forward, there has to be this big shift in the way that we approach sustainability because it's different to how we approach everything else. We have to work together. We have to have open sourcing. We have to have
Yeah.
much more sharing because company like if you have that competitive barrier up, I think it's very difficult then because you're then comparing what you do compared to another company and saying we're more sustainable, but actually
Yeah.
surely the end goal is that we're all sustainable. So I think going forward there has to be this shift in how we approach sustainability. Everything else we can still go fair game for, we can still have competition through our, coming out of our eyeballs, but I think when it comes to sustainability there has to be this future shift. It's
It's
again, I'm talking about it because it's easy for me to talk about and say, "Oh, we should all be working together." Obviously, the proof is in the pudding, and that's very difficult to do. I understand that, but I think that is those shifts are going to be really important.
yeah, so true, particularly with things like circular economy. There again, it's another one of those really complex structures. Like there's packaging, there's ingredients, there's the formulation. It's not going to be achievable if people are working alone.
It's
So
true.
Yeah, and it's difficult as well when you factor in the consumer into that because obviously a consumer has to be part of the circular economy because a lot is they're responsible for a big part of the circularity, I guess. Um, and I think that's where it's interesting because obviously as businesses we're a lot further down the line than the general consumer is. Because again, we all have to play catch up. We're only as educated as we want to be. So I think there is a long way to go, and we have to bring consumers with us. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done. I know this is being done by a number of different retailers and brands in different ways, with online courses or sort of refill stations in store that can now educate you on why you're doing this. With certain materials, education as well on the materials themselves and what that means. Um, a good example is a couple of years ago, particularly in probably talking more about a UK example, but plastic was it was basically demonized.
Yeah.
We didn't use plastic bags anymore. We didn't use plastic straws anymore. Lots of companies were using glass, aluminium. Change your packaging.
Mhm.
Plastic packaging is the worst. However, we have realized over the couple of years that actually plastic alternatives are good. But actually, if we have recycled plastics or plant-based plastics, they can actually be much more effective because aluminium and glass have their own sustainability issues. That
Exactly.
we suddenly realize that actually the most sustainable solution was a plastic solution. So I think it's always going to be difficult, I think, to take people forward with that. I do wonder for consumers. I think packaging is definitely one of the easiest things to understand because you finish a product and you're left with a package. So what do I do with it? And I do wonder if we're going to see this trend towards like mono-material packaging going forward because again I remember TerraCycle and I think it was L'Oreal ran these great campaigns on um, so once you'd finish with your products they would come and collect TerraCycle would come and collect the packaging and take it away to recycle. But the problem is with a lot of beauty products, whether you're moisturizers, anything in a pump or
Mhm.
shampoos and things, there's different components to your bottle, so you obviously have to take it apart and recycle it differently. So that in itself is
Right.
confusing and it's less convenient for consumers. So again, I do wonder if monomaterial is maybe the way forward in terms of, well, actually, if we can make it really easy, it's one material, we can just recycle that. I know again that won't work for every formulation, but
Mhm.
it's really interesting to see how going forward we have to evolve and we have to keep changing to help consumers out more and more.
Definitely. I guess consumers are looking for convenience, right? I mean, they want to be sustainable, but if it's not going to be easy for them to integrate into their lifestyles, is it going to really work and move forward? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I also think consumers are really educated now and they're motivated to take the right steps to be more sustainable. So even just letting them know, like if I picked up a bottle now, looking at it, I wouldn't be able to tell what type of plastic it is, how I should recycle it. But if the brands are doing education and they're telling consumers how to take care of their packaging so it goes to the right facilities and it's recycled the right way. I think consumers want to do that. It's just about educating them and making the information available so they can do so.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. I've seen more and more labeling on pack now
Mhm.
where brands are, specifically telling people this part can be recycled, do this with that, do this with that. And
Yeah.
I think that's super important because it comes back to the education side of things again, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's those simple things that will catch on because as like you both said there, actually, it's kind of you see like for example, you see like the triangle, the recyclable triangle on the packaging with a number in it. You don't know exactly what that means. So again, as you were saying, Jeline, that idea of having a bit more of an explanation or an education on pack, it's just those little things that I think will just change consumers' mindsets. And we do know this is becoming more important for consumers. Um, and they are willing to sort of almost put their wallet where their mouth is as well. This idea that um, we will boycott companies that aren't being sustainable. We will boycott companies that aren't being ethical. I found it fascinating this year. Our latest research has shown that a huge majority of consumers in China, for example, 88%, I think, believe that if a company is acting unethically, then they'll boycott them. And that's a huge figure, particularly
Yeah.
considering because 3 or 4 years ago, when we asked that question in China, it wasn't a majority. So it's
Wow.
amazing to just see that growth from consumers. So there is this idea, as you were saying, Christina, earlier, that they are becoming more educated. They do want to be more active. It's just how we help them.
Hmm.
Um, again, that's where the sustainability conversation is really interesting because sustainability isn't a driver for buying a product, right? Like if you wanted to be sustainable, you shouldn't really consume that much.
That's true.
However, if you're not sustainable, that is a big reason to not buy your product. So I think that's how you sort of flip it and just say, well, actually, we need to start being sustainable because it is going to be something that differentiates us, or it is going to be something that, if we're not being sustainable, then why would people look at us?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Do you think that it's fair to say that that's a lasting shift? It's not just a fad, is it? Or
I think it is. I think it's definitely sustainability is exactly that. It's not a fad, Jolene. It's kind of it's that idea that going forward we do need to have these shifts. I mean, the plastic straw and the plastic bag example we gave earlier is a good example because now people do use plastic bags less. It doesn't. I'm not saying that plastic bags don't exist, but you do think about, oh, I'm going to the shop. Oh no, I haven't, and then you almost feel guilty then buying a plastic bag. It's like, I left it in the car, or I didn't put it. I left it
Yeah.
at home. So the behavior slowly has changed, and that's a tiny thing, but I think behaviors do change in a little way, and that
Yeah.
does mean a lot for people. We are thinking about things a lot more sustainably now than we did before. I also find it fascinating as well when you think of there's so many brilliant sustainability initiatives that just were sort of launched years ago, and then but they didn't have an audience, whereas now they would. I remember the famous example is the Bic razors, so the
Mm.
plastic Bic razors. I
yeah,
remember going back to like the early 2000s, Bic launched a recycling program. So once you'd use your Bic razor, they had a program where they would recycle the razors for you, the
Yeah.
plastic and the metal. But it didn't hugely take off because sustainability wasn't talked about that much back then. So it's amazing if you had that old initiative, but you brought it out now, it would be interesting to just see how much more
Ex-
consumer uptake there would be for that. So I think
Yeah.
there's always that thought process of we can change behaviors and it is really important. I do think the climate emergency stuff is obviously in people's minds as well. So that is although that's maybe not positive messaging, it's a bit more fear messaging, which isn't great. But the climate emergency stuff does make people think that I do need to change for the long term. So I think it's definitely a long term behavioral shift rather than a fad.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is a big the last part that you touched on about fear-based selling, there's a big shift also in the beauty industry right now, to put a positive spin potentially on sustainability and, build community around their consumers, just to really have a joy-based selling approach rather than a fear-based selling approach. So I know you've spoken about that before, Andrew. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what joy-based selling really is and how brands can adopt this.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because we've literally just had some consumer data back that we haven't actually put on the platform yet, but I've literally just seen it, so I'm allowed to talk about it. But the data is amazing because it was all about how beauty makes you feel, and it was
Yeah,
amazing how huge majorities of people they buy beauty, and it was a European study we ran, but every single European country we ran it in, so the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. Every single one, the majority was all around the idea that I use cosmetics because they make me feel good. Beauty makes me feel good.
yeah,
Um, it's the emotional connection, the positivity that we have through beauty is a really fascinating one to look at.
yeah,
And I think that's a really interesting thing to look at as well because as a beauty industry, we do. And I say we do. I mean, I'm not sort of saying we all do this, but we have been known to in the past. We sell on insecurity. This idea that okay, there's an imperfection here, so
yeah,
it's all about selling on this idea of perfection. We want perfect skin. We want, the perfect
yeah.
aesthetic.
Covering
Uh,
grays, things like that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, covering grays, cover up your spots, your pimples, your
Mhm.
freckles even, it's kind of and I think there's always been this move towards of what the perfect ideal of beauty is. And that's always fascinating when you think of the fact that there isn't one. There's never has been one. If you went to different countries around this world and said, "What is beauty to you?" the image you got would be completely different from every single country. I remember years ago there was a study ran by someone who sent around a picture of a woman to digital photoshoppers around the world and
Yeah.
said, "Can you make this woman beautiful in your eyes?" And so it was amazing to see the different countries, the cultural differences that impact on that. Because obviously, in some cultures, thinking now of the UK potentially, we want to have tan skin. So we want to sort of darken the skin and have tan skin. But in other cultures, for example, in Asia Pacific, that's linked much more to sort of the aging and cultural and social differences as well. So
Yeah.
actually, tan skin isn't viewed in the same way as it is over here. So maybe lighter skin is maybe what's looked at over there. So it's amazing to just see that we've never had a perfect ideal of beauty. So why have we ever sold on it? Why have we ever sold on this one ideal of beauty? And that again is, I think, where the positivity thing comes in. Because I'm
Yeah.
not saying that people won't use makeup products, or they won't. That there isn't this idea that we can all look good. I know that people get a lot of joy out of looking good. We've got some great data around women in the UK and in the US who use makeup because it makes them feel good. It empowers them. They wear makeup for themselves.
Right.
So there definitely is this joy in looking good as well. I'm not saying that it's not about that. It's not about the aesthetic, but it's just the empowering message around beauty. As I say, that positive spin, saying to kids, you know what, you're 13 years old, you've got spots. You know what? Go out and play, go out and see your friends, go to the cinema, go socialize.
Yeah.
You can use these products to help get rid of the spots, of course. It will pass. It's okay. I
It's
think those kind
okay.
of positive
Yeah.
messages are what we need going forward rather than saying, "Oh my god, you've got spots, stay inside until you get rid of them." You know what I mean? Like cover them up. And I
100%.
think beauty has seen that shift. I mean, the fashion industry has always been a real pioneer in that space as well, sort of celebrating um, sort of images that aren't always particularly viewed as sort of the idea of perfection. So I think that the idea of positivity in the industry is a great way of selling. And I think for sustainability, if you're always talking about, oh, the planet's going to die, you're ruining this, you're ruining that.
Yeah.
I think that's something that's always thrown at the Gen Z, is because they're always moaning. And they have every right to moan as well, by the way. When you see the figures and you see everything, it's like they do have a right to. But that's always the easy way out is always, they're just moaning about it. They don't know about it. But actually, if their message was different, maybe people would look on it differently. So I think around
Yeah.
sustainability, we do need more positive messaging to say, you know what, we can do things better. We can always do things better.
Yeah, and it's all about that sense too of like we're doing it better together.
Mhm.
There's a community sense to it. It's doing right for the people around you and building a community and having that positive spin on sustainability. Like you said, the last thing that you want to think about is like, oh, the planet's dying. When you buy a certain material, you kind of want to think, I'm buying this material. It's in plastic that can be easily recycled. I'm doing the right thing for the environment. And it makes them feel good. Just like you said, beauty products make people feel good. I think purchasing sustainably is turned into something that can make you feel good. And a lot of consumers look for that.
And that idea of community is, if we go back to the metrics idea that we talked about earlier as well, it's also really interesting because then if you don't meet certain metrics, if that's what we're tracking nowadays, you don't meet certain markers, it's almost not to shame you into it, but it's almost then like, okay, I need to catch up then. I need to play, I need to
Yeah.
play in this area, and I need to make sure that I'm catching up. So it's almost like gamifying the whole process. I mean, again, the climate situation, I'm no sort of a climate expert, but the climate situation is bad. I understand that.
Yeah.
And I'm not to belittle that and say that, you know what, actually, if we put a positive message on it, it'll be much better, because obviously it is bad for a reason and we do need action. Action definitely needs to be taken now. But then once that action is in place, actually, again, we're having those more positive messages around, you know what, actually, global warming, the temperature now has only risen by X amount, and we're reaching the goals now. I think that
Yeah.
kind of process is also really, really interesting to look at. So, yeah, that positive messaging, it isn't always about this sort of amazing sort of utopia messaging of the world is great. But I
Yeah.
think those steps going forward are really important to sort of have called out.
Yeah, it's just much more inspirational, isn't it? If you know this positive messaging, it inspires you to want to go and make that change. If you're basically told that we've got no hope, then what's the point? I guess at least what's going through people's minds. So
Well, that's it as well, because sometimes these big figures are talked about, and the problem is they're so big, and you can't quite get your head around them
It's true.
as one individual.
yeah,
So therefore, it's almost like, well, we're doomed then, aren't we? Because there's nothing we
Yeah.
can do. So that, I think you're right there, Gillian. We need to have just sort of, what can we do? How can, have those positive spins, have those positive messages? I think that is what we need to look at going forward.
When I'm using Mintel, when I'm looking for products with sustainable or ethical claims, so I can identify products that are doing the right thing and taking the right steps. It really is just such a broad term, like ethics and sustainability and these claims, and they're often lumped together. Like, I want a product with sustainable claims. Well, what does that mean? What is really a sustainable claim? So, I guess maybe can you touch on how maybe Mintel breaks that down a little bit? And then what are some of the fastest growing trends or claims in sustainability or in ethical claims? What do you see as growing the fastest?
Yeah, of course. I think that's a really good question, and a good question about Mintel as well, actually, because I remember when I started at Mintel, we had these sort of tags around what were ethical claims, and it'd be an ethical claim, and then explaining what part of the ethical claim it was.
Yeah.
And the problem with that was, when I started, there weren't that many. I think there was maybe 4 or 5. And now if you go onto the GMPD and we look at the claims that we sort of group into, I think there's 10 different ethical claims now. So we've doubled those, because there are so many different
Mhm.
ones. So we have things like animal claims, so looking at sort of animal ingredients, so not necessarily vegan, but obviously a lot of vegan stuff will sort of be grouped into that. So if there's any vegan claims, that will be an ethical animal claim, but also cruelty-free claims as well. We'll also sort of tap into that a little bit more. Environmentally sort of or sustainable packaging claims as well is another thing that we sort of symbolize and highlight. But that goes in 2 ways. So we have a claim around environmentally friendly packaging, which is all about the materials, or
Yeah.
the way products are made and recycling and things like that. But then we also do have a separate recycling claim that we group by as well. So if a product
Okay.
makes a recycling claim in particular, so the packaging claim is much more about the materials and everything. Recycling may well be a part of that, but we also have recycling separate, because again, it's something our clients have asked for, is, okay, can we actually see about recycling claims a bit more? So there's those kind of things to look at as well. On top of that, you then have sort of obviously formulation claims. So if the formulation or the product itself makes any sustainable claims or environmentally friendly claims, again, we group that slightly differently. But claims around helping out habitat, so biodiversity claims, we
Mhm.
also look at. Any sort of charity or human claims as well will also separate by that. Other ethical claims as well are also around sort of biodegradable and carbon neutral as well. So they're also claims that we group in those sort of ethical and sustainability claims as well. So there's a whole host of these different claims that we categorize into. So hopefully that makes it easy if you're looking for something specific. Of course, we can also search by just ethical claim and just see the whole group together.
General,
But
yeah.
but you can sort of dive down into that, and that's been really interesting to see then, because obviously this is from a product point of view, so it's not actually asking consumers, but it's interesting to see this because obviously if you put something on a product, then your understanding is, this is something you want to portray across to consumers. And the
Right.
claims that we've seen grow most over the last sort of 5 years, driven mainly, as I mentioned, the vegan trend earlier, that's massively driven the amount of animal claims we see on pack.
Yeah.
So that's probably been the fastest growing claim over the last 5 years in beauty and personal care. Packaging claims, as I say, are always big. Year on year, there's a huge growth in packaging claims. And that's whether it's mass market or sort of the luxury market as well. We've seen sustainable packaging claims have grown in a big way.
Yeah.
And also, as I say, biodiversity claims are sustainable around sort of the habitat or the resources that are used that go into a product. Sustainability claims around that have also increased massively over the last sort of 5 years as well. It's worth pointing out that every single sustainable and ethical claim that we track has grown over the last
Yeah.
5 years. However, the ones that haven't grown as much on pack, so it just means that they're not being featured on pack as much. But the ones that have grown sort of slower are biodegradability and carbon neutral. And I think that's interesting because it goes back to what we were talking about before about understanding, consumer
Yeah.
understanding. Consumers don't fully know what biodegradable means. We a great example of this is remember the wet wipe example. So you had
Yeah.
that example where biodegradable wet wipes, and everyone was like, "This is brilliant. Must be more sustainable." Actually, you couldn't flush them still, so it still wasn't this case that it was fully biodegradable. And then the consumer thinks, "Well, I don't understand what biodegradability is then."
Yeah.
So I think that's maybe why that hasn't grown as much on pack, or it's not used as much as the other claims, is because again there's an understanding around it, and I definitely think that's the case for carbon neutral because
Yeah.
there's some research as well that I can share with you around sort of carbon, but the amount of different carbon terms that are floating around in the beauty industry: carbon neutral, carbon positive, carbon
Positive.
negative. There's carbon, zero carbon, net carbon. There's
Mhm.
so many of them that it's difficult to always know exactly what every single one means. So
Yeah.
again, I think that's maybe why we haven't seen so much growth of that on pack as well, is because your packaging is real estate, right? And you don't want to use it up with stuff that's going to take up space that isn't needed. So I think the claims that we are seeing on pack around sustainability, animal, and resources or habitat or formula,
Mm-hmm.
those four are a lot easier to understand what you kind of mean when you see that claim on the pack. So I think that's probably why.
Yeah.
But we do see, as I say, we do see a big growth in all sustainability claims. Again, probably unsurprising given the way the world's going right now.
Are you also seeing a particular format on the rise? So I'm thinking about water conscious formulations, for example. So a lot more solid type formats or anhydrous formats. Is that something that's on the rise, or is that more something that people are talking about, but it's not actually being reflected in products being launched?
It's definitely the solid format's really interesting to look at because that is something now that is slowly beginning to catch up with the talk. Because I remember 2015, 2016, we talked to clients and they'd always ask us, particularly in hair care, for example,
Yeah.
they'd always ask us about sort of solid shampoos and solid conditioners.
Mm.
And there was so much interest in that or that product format. Um, the problem was that no one was willing to take the gamble because still when people use a shampoo or a conditioner, we expect it to work in a particular way. We're so used to a gel or a liquid format or a cream
Yeah.
format that the solid format was just a bit too disruptive for people. However, we have seen through body care actually, because obviously we're used to bar soaps. Having sort of bar shampoos come through has happened more so in the last couple of years. I mean, you'd probably be able to recall yourself the amount of bigger brands or bigger companies now that you see that have launched sort of shampoo bars and things like that. So it's definitely something that's taking on more and more. Thinking about sort of the biggest players in our industry, they've all tapped into this now. I think there's a lot of refining still to do. in these categories. But the solid format is one that I think is a really interesting one to look at. And it's not just bar formats either. Powder formats are being looked at a lot more as well.
Mm.
Really interesting. Also, it taps into this whole sort of transformative texture as well. If you have a powder that you can just sort of apply a little bit of water to, or if you have these transformative textures, again, that's appealing. It's exciting to see that. And that's the other thing. We don't talk about that enough, in my opinion, but the galenic properties of cosmetics is really important.
Yeah.
If something feels really horrible when I put it on, I'm probably going to stop putting it on.
Yeah.
That's
So,
true.
so again, the galenic properties are really important. So I think a lot of these powders and things like that, they tap into that idea. So there are formats I think that are a little bit more exciting, and that solid side of thing is definitely looking like it is in the beauty space. But I think what you said there, Jolene, about water consumption being a big focus, definitely seems to be something we're seeing a lot right now. And again, also something we're seeing impacts from other industries. So things like the sort of the Liquitab example, where you have like a concentrated formula that we use in household care for our
Yeah.
laundry and things like that.
Mhm.
Again, those kinds of pods or things like that can be used in beauty products, in skincare and hair care. So it's interesting to borrow what we see in other categories and bring that into sustainability.
Yeah.
Definitely, like you say, those transformative type textures, they're so fun to use, and that links back to that joy-based messaging. I think if we can just be more positive and joyful in general, it's a good way to sell, isn't it?
Exactly that.
I had one final question. Might be bad timing for speaking about joy and positivity, but just talking about rising trends and formats and everything makes me think of uh, how the risers have changed over the last 3 years because of the pandemic. I mean, I'm sure the pandemic had a massive impact on the beauty industry and what people were buying and why. So, is there anything that you can kind of connect to reason as why things were rising or falling based on the pandemic and how that shifted beauty?
Yeah, of course. It's really interesting actually to see the behavior shift throughout the pandemic, because we were very lucky that because we own all our own data and all our own surveys, we could still run those during the pandemic. So
Mhm.
we were able to sort of track consumer behavior. We're actually doing it on a weekly basis to sort of see how we were shopping differently or what we were shopping for. And it's amazing that when the pandemic first hit, health becomes the biggest thing, as it should. So
Yeah.
we always think about health. So those kind of products became really important. And
Yeah.
to be fair, derma cosmetics and sort of skin health products were on the rise before the pandemic. So in a way, the pandemic almost accelerated some of these
Mhm.
trends. Um, I think this idea around community sort of pitching in and humanity itself, again, that was something maybe not from a product side of things, but from just a general trend side of thing, a general feeling that has definitely accelerated because of the pandemic. We do see that then drops off a little bit as we come. I'm not saying we're out of the pandemic just now, but as we come out of pandemics, we do see that drop off a little bit. It's just interesting to see how some of those things will stay. There will be some lasting behavior. And I think around health, as I say, because that was a trend before, that
Mhm.
will continue. And I
Yeah.
think the same can be said about sustainability, because it was trending before. Then when the pandemic hit, I think that it went out of the window a little bit. People were maybe panic. It depends what market you were in,
Mhm.
and maybe what culture you're from. But people were panic buying things. Um,
Mhm.
just thinking of toilet roll here in the UK, we panic bought
Yeah.
that a lot.
Yep.
People were doing that quite a lot. So sustainability wasn't so much in your mindset at that point. However, the really interesting thing was it then flipped back to sustainability, because we realized when we weren't going out as much, when we were in lockdown, we weren't impacting or polluting the planet as much, and
It's
the planet
true.
was a much nicer place to be. Because I remember seeing amazing footage of the Himalayas
Yeah.
that you could see from the cities in India, which normally there would just be a thick fog over, so you couldn't see them. Or the canals in Venice were clear,
Yeah.
which again just wouldn't normally have happened because of the general pollution. So I think it highlighted to people the impact we have on the planet. So it made people stop and think about what their impacts are. We also stopped as well and probably thought, I don't need to use as many products as I'm currently using because I'm just sitting at home now.
Mhm.
Um, so again, it made people a little bit more aware, or more mindful of their consumption. So I think we saw that going forward. So that again accelerated that shift in sustainability behavior for consumers. So I think that's a lasting behavior again that again will continue. And I think the pandemic sort of accelerated that. because again, it gave us that moment to stop and think.
Yeah. I think, like you say, you just flat out, you can't be sustainable if you're over consuming products. So there's this element of like minimalism, I think, that we're seeing in sustainability now, which is, I think, resonating with a lot of younger people too. There's a trend with like Gen Z and millennials to use less products, use more efficient but less products. So it's good to see from a sustainability standpoint because it just reiterates the messaging that you can't overconsume if you want to have a sustainable world.
It changes behaviors ultimately for people, and it's really interesting from a product point of view what that will mean, because it could mean things like multifunctional products, which again always go in peaks and troughs. But again, if you can buy one product that does multiple things, as long as it's doing those things effectively, then that's
Yeah.
going to be much more appealing than having to buy loads of different products. And I also think as well that just living costs in general shifting over 2021 and 2022 with everything that's gone on and is going on in the world
Yeah.
is also really interesting again to see how that will shift things going forward, because again, you're going to be thinking much more about your own personal budgets, your living costs, obviously rising prices for gas and oil and things like that.
Hmm.
We're going to feel that most in the supply chain again. So it's interesting from a sustainability point of view, just solely looking at it from this point of view, not the sort of the social aspects, but the idea that sustainability alternatives or sustainable alternatives that maybe cost more to produce in years gone by, with rising gas prices and oil prices, those costs are going to go up anyway. So actually, those alternatives that were much more sustainable and weren't reliant on fossil fuels, they may actually be leveling out now. So
It's
again,
true.
this move towards renewable energies or moving now towards sustainable alternatives, again, we could be not pushed towards that, but it could be the economic thing to do as well going forward. So it's going to be
Yeah.
really interesting just to see how this evolves and continues to do so.
Yeah, super interesting. It's gonna speed up a conversion to a more sustainable future. Then it's one of those things, isn't it? It's bad yet good. So
Hmm.
looking for a silver lining, maybe we should say.
Exactly.
Yeah. Christina, did you have anything else that you wanted to ask?
No, I think I'm good. I don't know about you guys, but now this conversation makes me excited to see what's to come. I mean, obviously there's a lot of like talked about fun textures and positive possibilities that we could look into in beauty for sustainable options. So just makes me excited to see what'll be the conversation next year and how it's changed.
Definitely. Andrew, is there anything in particular that we haven't asked you that you think actually is really important to point out whilst we're talking about sustainability?
I'm not sure because I feel like I've been talking for ages anyway, so I've probably talked about a lot of things that you didn't ask me to talk about. But
Perfect.
I do just generally think that for sustainability going forward, and it's right through from the consumer right through, is we need to kind of bring everyone with us now. You're only as quick as your slowest person in this one, so
Yeah.
it's important to bring everyone with you, and that is going to mean, as I say, these shifts in the way that we operate when it comes to sustainability. So whether that's sharing more, educating more, or just dealing with issues as a collective, I think is going to be much more powerful. So that's going to be the really important message. But I agree, it's going to be very interesting to sort of see if we're going to be having the same conversation in a year's time, because again, there may be something else. There may be something else that we're talking about. So it's always going to be evolving, and it's exciting to see what will evolve.
Hmm.
Wow, yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been super interesting listening to everything that you've had to say on the topic. And I'd love to point out to our listeners that at Mintel you have your own podcast, The Little Conversation. So just to encourage people to go and check that out. But is there anything else I should point out about Mintel, Andrew, if they want to get hold of you to go check out
No,
mintel.com perhaps? Or...
I'm really appreciating the podcast plug there. No, so I
It's all
appreciate that. But
right.
yeah, no, of course, if there's anything for any more of the information or data, then the best place to go would be mintel.com, just to find out more. You'll find out links to obviously the client parts of the website you can go to, or indeed you can find out information on the blog, or indeed just find out more from our analysts who write on there all the time. So mintel.com is definitely the best place for that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew.
Perfect.
Really appreciate your time.